Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Ashafil Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Once the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam were sitting around the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the companions and the Sahabas, they were a bit hesitant, they were a bit reluctant to ask any questions to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason why they were hesitant or reluctant is because just before a verse was revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu la tas'alu an ashya'a in tubdalakum tasukkum, which means that, O people who believe, do not ask any futile questions to the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do not ask any unnecessary questions to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? Because there may be a danger, an apprehension that by you asking a futile question to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that thing becomes farz, that thing becomes a part of the deen, that thing becomes part of the sharia, and by that thing becoming part of the sharia, i.e. in other words, it becomes farz, then it'll be difficult for you guys to act upon. So the Sahabas, they were around Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, very reluctant to ask a question, thinking that the question they asking could be futile, could be unnecessary, hence asking the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they always wished that perhaps someone from the Bedouin, someone from the villages, ajnabi, a stranger, would come and then ask Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam certain questions about the deen. So they have this kind of tashaffi bakhsh in their heart, they have this kind of contentment in their heart that the questions about the religion, about the deen, they would be able to get with this stranger or with this person coming to ask Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now one day somebody answered the prayers of the Sahabas, and from this we can understand, and this is something, a great feature of the Sahabas and the friends of Allah and the wali of Allah, that sometimes they don't actually make a dua verbally on their tongue, but they make the dua in their hearts. And when that dua is made in their heart, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts it. And there's many examples of pious people, pious predecessors, when somebody gave them some taklif, so from their heart some kind of words of anger came out, which led to that person's destruction. So similarly, the Sahabas, they had this will and had this kind of, made this dua in their heart that somebody comes. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted the dua, and this person came, and as mentioned in the hadith, that none of the Sahabas recognized who this person was. It didn't seem as though that he was traveling, because there was no specks of dirt or stain on his clothes. So he comes to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this person, no one recognizes him. It didn't seem as though that he was traveling or he conversed a lot of places. And he comes and he sits next to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He puts his hands on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's thighs, and he asks 3 questions. And the 3 questions he asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, number 1 is, what is the definition of Islam? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave the reply that Islam means to say verbally that you believe in one God, to establish namaz, to give zakat, to do hajj, to fast in the month of Ramadan, and so on and so forth. And the second question which he asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the definition of Iman. And the definition which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave of Iman was to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to believe in life after death, to believe in angels, to believe in fate, to believe in the good of faith, the bad of faith, i.e. basically what we call the basic tenets of Islam, to believe in the previous prophets, to believe in the scriptures of Allah. So that is the definition of Iman. And then the third thing which he asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was, what is the definition of Ihsan? what does ihsan mean? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave the reply that ihsan is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a way that you are seeing him, and if you cannot manage to do that, then you should worship Allah. Sorry, the first part of the hadith was worship Allah in a way that you are seeing him, and if you cannot manage to do that, then worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in such a way that he is watching over you and he is looking all over you when you are praying salah and when you are doing the various ibadat and the various worships of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, great scholars in the past have said that ihsan is something which knits Iman and Islam together. It's like, say for example, it's the cement which you need to put the tiles together, or it's that glue you need to put the tiles or to put the glass together. So this is what ihsan is, that we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are also doing lot of actions, lot of ibadat in terms of namaz, zakat, hajj, fasting and so on and so forth. But what kind of glues our actions, our zahiri actions, our apparent actions with our iman and with our belief is ihsan. Now, what does ihsan mean? I mentioned that it glues the two things together. But ihsan means to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in an efficient way and in a proper and in a good way. The word ihsan comes from the word hasan, and hasan means something good. So when we say to do your ibadat with ihsan or to do your worship with ihsan, it means to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a good way, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala properly. And what we mean by doing it properly is that when we are worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we are reciting Quran, like the other week I was explaining to the brothers who were here about dua, that when we are doing dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then to have the presence of mind. That when you are asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it shouldn't be, as I was explaining to the brothers, that dua nowadays have become a bit more accustomed. That we just raise our hand and we just say, Allahumma atina fi dunya hasana wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina azaban nar. Whereas dua, the meaning of dua is that when you asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you should ask with the presence of mind. That, oh Allah, you give us good in this world. Oh Allah, give us good in this world and give us good in the akhirah and in the hereafter. If you just like saying the words, Allah is not going to accept the dua. It has to be like proper concentration and devotion. You make the dua, Rabbana faghfir lana zunubana. When you ask Allah to forgive your sins, there has to be devotion there. If you are just saying it just because you're the imam and you have to make dua, otherwise the elders on the first row are going to start complaining. If you're just going to do it for the sake of it, just for the rasam and for the custom, then dua is not going to be accepted. It's only when you see it sincerely and with devotion, you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when dua is accepted. And that's with all worships of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it's duas, whether it's tilawat Quran, whether it's zikr, there has to be the devotion. And when that devotion and sincerity and ikhlas is there, only then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts the ibadat and accepts the worship. So basically, ihsan in a nutshell is to do things in a good way, in an efficient way, to do things with sincerity and with devotion. That what is ihsan, and that in a nutshell is something which is called ihsan, which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam described in this particular hadith. Now, ihsan is something which no one can deny. Whether you want to call it ihsan, whether you want to call it tasawwuf, whether you want to give it some other names, suluk, path of suluk and so on, you could give it so many different names, but the concept of it is still the same, which is worshipping Allah with devotion and the spiritual rectification and the purification of the heart. And there are many Quranic verses, we don't have time to look at all of them, which talks about ihsan and purification of the heart. وَيُزَكِّيكُمْ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ الْكِتَابُ الْحِكْمَةِ, a verse which we hear many times. One of the responsibilities of the Prophet and a Nabi, to teach people the book, to teach people wisdom and hikmah, and to spiritually purify people and his followers. And also on top of that, there are many hadiths, hundreds of hadiths, not like say even thousands you could say, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has touched on the importance of spiritually rectifying your heart. Some of the hadiths I'm sure we've heard before. The hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that there is a flesh in the body, that if you just let it, if you rectify, the entire body is rectified. If you let it go bad, the entire body goes bad. There's another hadith of Sunan al-Bayhaqi. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that for everything there is a polish, and the polish of the heart is dhikrullah. Another hadith of Sunan ibn Majah, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to Hazrat Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas anhu that, O Sa'd, you are one of the dwellers of Jannah, that you are guaranteed Jannah and paradise. So one of the Sahabas who heard Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam say this, he then spent one night with Hazrat Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas anhu. He wanted to see that what does Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas anhu does, which has guaranteed him Jannah and paradise in this world. Now at the end of the night, that person who spent the night with Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas anhu, he turns around and he says to him that, look, I've spent a night with you, you're just doing normal a'mals. I can't say you're doing something brilliant or something so good where I can pinpoint and say that this is taking you towards Jannah. So then Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas anhu replied by saying that I don't do any excessive actions. Obviously Sahabas, they were tahajjud, guzar and so on. So don't get the wrong meaning that, they never used to spend the whole night sleeping. They used to do their tahajjud, their ma'mulat. But what Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas anhu would do is that when he would go to sleep, he would go to sleep with a pure and a clean heart. I.e., he would not have any hasad or hatred or jealousy against anyone. So purification of the heart is something which is mentioned in many places in the Quran, which can be found in many ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So whether you want to call it tasawwuf, tazkiyah, whether you want to call it suluk or ihsan, but the concept of it can be found in the Quran, and the concept of it can be found in the hadith. And this is something where a lot of people will ask this question that, well, it's not found in the Quran. Remember, when it comes to rulings or mas'alas or fatwas, we look at the concept and not regarding the words. Because there is a hadith which we'll probably touch on some other time, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that one of the signs of Day of Judgment will be that people would make alcohol lawful. Now the way they're not going to make alcohol lawful is like, it's not like people are going to start drinking alcohol and so on. No, the way they will make it lawful is that they will have alcohol, but they'll give you a different name. So they'll give you a nice fancy name like Coke or just, for example, or Pepsi or whatever, orange. But because the thingy, what's inside is got alcohol there, so therefore it will become haram. But people will say, oh, it's orange, let's drink it. So what I'm trying to say is that rulings is given on concepts. Nowadays you have all these nice business terminologies used, but when you look at the haqiqat and the essence of it is interest. So you're not going to say it's jais. Why? Just because there's no interest word there or riba there on the name, it doesn't mean it's lawful. So exactly here as well, that there's different names people are giving to it, and people are saying, well, there's no basis of the Sharia. Why? There's no such word as tasawwuf in the Quran or hadith, or no such word as suluk in the Quran and hadith. But as I was saying, we don't look at the words, we look at the concept. And the concept can be found in the Quran and hadith. Like the example I gave with alcohol, that because it's alcohol there, so irrespective of what name is given, it will still be unlawful and haram. Now obviously, we've been attached to the Jamaat for many years. For some are probably newcomers. But obviously, we've always had this particular question, or people raise this objection that this zikr which we are doing, or tasawwuf or tazkiyah, this is a bid'ah and so on, an innovation. Now, firstly, the best way to understand people who ask questions is people who ask questions about tazkiyah and tasawwuf, and those who say it's an innovation. It's basically, when you look at the crux of the matter, or the gist of it, is that they don't have any knowledge about the topic. Those who have no knowledge, they just say, oh, it's a bid'ah. It's like when we were in madrasas and when we were like students, there were certain topics which were very difficult, like say inheritance, certain rules about say business. They were very tricky, very difficult for the students to comprehend and understand. So you'll get people, because they find it difficult, they'll say, oh, it's not important to learn about inheritance, or it's not important to learn about business. There were certain things, certain books which we would learn when we were students about the eloquence of the Quran, which will go really into detail. So again, some students will say, oh, it's not important to learn about the eloquence of the Quran. As long as you know how to read Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, that's sufficient. Now the reason why they're saying it, that it's not important, because they can't understand it. So because they don't know anything about it, they can't understand it, they'll just say, oh, this is not important. So exactly same when it comes to Tasawwuf Tazkiyah, because very, very few people, even from the ulamas, very, very few ulamas actually know the true haqiqat and essence of it, then what happens, they are very easy to say, oh, this is all a bid'ah, because they can't be bothered to tell the truth, to actually sit down with a book about Tasawwuf Tazkiyah and then read from cover to cover, from page 1 to page, Wallah alam, 200, whatever of that book. They don't have the time, so they say, oh, this is a bid'ah, this is an innovation. Or the much quicker way to do it nowadays, you just do a Google search, and whatever the first link comes, or Tasawwuf is a bid'ah, and they just say, oh, this is Tasawwuf is a bid'ah. So this is unfortunately what happens now, because people lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, lack of having that open mind to actually understand this topic. That's why people very easily say it's a bid'ah and it's a shirk or whatever. So this is something which is wrong. As I said, that it's a teaching of the Quran, it's the teaching of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Tasawwuf, tazkiyah, purification of the heart is something which was practiced by all our kabirin. When you look at our pious predecessors, like Mona Shir Ahmad Gongoi rahimullah, Mona Shir Falitan rahimullah, all of them, they all had shuyus, they all did the tazkiyah, they all did zikr regularly. They would do zikr and remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is something which is a very, very important aspect of our deen and aspect of our religion. Now very quickly, just for the newcomers who are here, there are obviously four, same way you have four schools of thought, similarly you also have what we call four schools of thought in terms of tasawwuf and tazkiyah. You have Chishtiya, Qadriya, Suharwardiya, and then the last one you have is Naqshbandiya, number 4. And that is split up into two groups. One is called Mujaddidiya, who do loud zikr and also silent zikr as well. And then the second group you have is Naqshbandiya, Uwaisiya, the one which we follow. And obviously we concentrate more on silent zikr. But the way we do it is exactly same when you look at it to a loud zikr. The same way, if anybody been or attended a loud zikr gathering, then they do the same thing as well. They close their eyes, they move their head, and they say Allahu. They say the exactly same thing as well. But the way we do it is that we don't actually say verbally. We just close our mouth and then we breathe the word Allah in. Same way, when they were, if somebody was doing loud zikr, he will actually rock his head back and forth, saying Allahu, Allahu. We do the same thing as well, but the only difference is that we won't say verbally. We keep our mouth closed and then we breathe the word Allah in and we breathe the word Hu out. And the first part of the zikr, what we imagine is that the word Hu is striking the qalb, the first latifa, which you call it. Obviously for the new satis, you don't have to worry too much about the latifas just now. So it's the area just below your left nipple. So that's where the qalb or the spiritual heart is. So you imagine that the word Hu is striking that. So you do the first part of the zikr. Thereafterwards, after we've done that, we do the next part of the zikr, which is the muraqabah, which is obviously, in other words, meditation. And in this time, we just obviously breathe normally. We breathe the word Allah in, and then we take the word Hu out, and then we imagine that the word Hu is ascending upwards towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's arsh and throne. So this is a way, or a nuskha, you could say, like a guideline which our pious predecessors have taught us to spiritually rectify ourselves. I was explaining that this is something which is very, very important. So this is the guidelines, or this is what we use to spiritually rectify ourselves. So this is something which is very, very important to constantly be regular in our dhikr. As I was explaining, that one of the main benefits of doing the zikr is that sincerity and ikhlas. I was explaining to the brothers last week that hadith of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can take khidmat of deen from anyone. He can take khidmat of deen from a non-believer. This, I was explaining that I think the roof here was actually a Sikh guy came and he helped out with the roofing as well. So to build a masjid, a Sikh could come, a non-Muslim could come, someone who doesn't like Islam, an enemy of Islam, he could come and build a masjid. If he's a builder or a contractor, he could come and do something for the masjid. So when it comes for deen ki khidmat, Allah could take it from anyone. Right? Just like giving talks and lectures, anybody could do that. You don't even have to be practicing. Anybody could give a lecture or a talk. But what is the main difference is that for qabuliyat is separate. Allah could take khidmat of anyone, but Allah accepting your effort, that's another thing. And that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at sincerity, looks at ikhlas and so on. And I gave the example of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam, that when they constructed the Kaaba, you're probably thinking that they've done such a great thing, constructed the Kaaba, they're like guaranteed Jannah. There's no need for them to make dua. But instead, after they did the Kaaba, what was the dua they made? Rabbana taqabbal minna. Oh Allah, accept us. Innaka antas samiul alim. Wa tub alayna innaka antat tawwabur rahim. So what we can derive from here is that whenever we do any good actions, any dhikr, any kind of deed, we should always pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept our efforts for qabuliyat. Even the center which we have, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we should always pray to Allah that He accepts this center and accepts our effort for the deen. May Allah give us tawfiq to act on what He said. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi.